So for this last lecture, I did a lot of cropping and refurbishing of what I had, because well, finally now I understand more or less what the audience likes most in terms of information on evolution. So in the end, I think we're going to cover most of the important subjects, at least in general outline. So I'll just start with a little bit of follow-up on what we saw yesterday, but just a few couple of minutes, which is still a little bit of phylogenetic analysis and phylogenetic relationships. Notice, when I say phylogenetic, that doesn't mean that necessarily it is genetic information. Phylogenetics means a method for reconstructing history. You can do phylogenetics of fossils without a single molecule of DNA, okay? So what matters is the method by which you organize information to come up with a hypothesis of relationship. So you can do phylogenetics on the basis of behavior, you can do phylogenetics on the basis of morphology, you can do phylogenetics on the basis of whatever you want, as long as it is comparative information intrinsic to the development of an organism, all right? So don't get deceived by the word genetic at the end. Well, I'm a phylogeneticist, and I also work with genetic data, but I work with morphology too. I work with behavior too. I work with any kind of biologically intrinsic comparative data. All right, so one interesting thing that I think it's worth mentioning on this subject is that phylogenetics has been used to other historical sciences, and the most interesting of which is linguistics. Phylolinguistics or philology or something like that, has several different names, very successfully. And most interestingly, this subject in linguistics is very old. It has existed for a long time. But after the second half of the 20th century, it began to import or borrow methods developed in biology to apply to its own subjects or its own subject studies. So where we see species, linguists see languages. And languages also have an evolutionary history. Languages, they change and diversify over time. And the mode of change is very, very similar to what we see in biology. It's biology-like. The behavior of languages is very similar to the behavior of biological lineages. So for example, we can have monophyletic groups of languages. Romance languages are a monophyletic group. They all come from the same ancestral language, which is Latin. And since this is all historically documented, or most of it, or a lot of it is historically documented, it is a very interesting way of checking the efficiency of phylogenetic reconstruction methods. And they work very well. It's actually surprisingly well, and there is a flood of papers in the past few years just constructing phylogenetic relationships or phylogenetic trees of languages in general. And they seem to work very well. Since you cannot actually check these things in many instances because you have documents that show the process of descent, as if we could see biological evolution in action. In languages we can. We have documents that prove that. So the methods can be very efficiently tested. For example, there's a flood of papers in this journal, cladistics. Cladistics, by the way, is one word that people use for phylogenetic relationships. There's a journal just called cladistics. And you see lots of papers. This is just a few. Some people use it for reconstructing archaeological phylogenies too, to reconstruct the history of archaeological sites, using the characteristics of the artifacts you find there as characters. And you come up with a history of those communities that worked there, that lived there in the specific places. So in many different languages, not only Indo-European, but African languages as well, things we don't know that much about. And there are even methods of comparison between languages, comparisons of different methods for phylogenetic reconstruction applied to the same problem, like likelihood, parsimony, Bayesian, and things like that. So the method seems to be very general. It seems to apply to any historical science. Anything that follows a process of descent modification seems to be treatable by phylogenetic methods in general. They seem to be pretty efficient for that. Of course, the method of inheritance change, the entities are very different, but there is always a process of descent modification. So the characters also undergo change along the lineages. But now I want to go back to natural selection, which we saw before. We saw these slides and we know what it is about. Because there are some subtleties of the method of the process that we haven't seen and which are very worth exploring a little bit. natural selection has been heavily quantified very early on in the history of evolutionary biology. In the 1920s and 30s, most of the theory of natural selection and genetics was developed. Notice that at this time, people didn't even know what was the basis of genetic information. They didn't know the structure of the DNA molecule. They didn't know even that it was certainly DNA. They didn't know much, but they did know the behavior of the bits of information, of genetic information. They behaved according to Mendelian laws. So it was very possible to quantify natural selection and all its corollaries without knowing anything about the molecular basis of the gene, of genetic information. And this allowed a tremendous development early on in the history of evolutionary biology, with all the equations being solved and so on. Everybody has studied this. I don't remember if we studied this in high school or later, but Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is what you expect for genetic frequencies if you don't have selection, if you have an infinite population number, and things like that. Totally unrealistic conditions, but on getting the values that you expect for unrealistic conditions, you can then see what in reality is changing these numbers. So this came up very early on by the work of actually two mathematicians, these two guys. One of them was also a geneticist. But mathematicians liked this subject a lot in the beginning because it was very deductive. You didn't need to know much about biology to make very significant progress there. So there was a lot of input from mathematicians in the beginning. Fisher was one of the most important contributors at this time. But, sorry, we're talking about 1930 here. This is a very, very important book. You can still read it today as current science. This is like arithmetic or algebra or something like that. Like it never changes. Okay, this is how it is. Of course, there's a lot after it, but this is still valid science. One thing that many people bring about natural selection is it circular? What is it? What is natural selection exactly? Is it a theory or is it a method? What is it? Because many people think natural selection has a kind of circular aspect to it. It's survival of the fittest, and who are the fittest? The fittest are the ones that you measure to be the ones who survived it differentially, right? So for a while, people were bringing this up all the time. Well, maybe natural selection is not really a theory, but it's kind of tautological. It relies on circular reasoning, as they call. When I was a student, this bothered me a little bit as well. For a while, I was like, natural selection is not really an explanation. It is something different that I can't quite define. Eventually, I reconciled myself with this after reading a lot of people, and I saw that even early contributors to the theory of population genetics had dealt with the problem in a very simple and enlightening way. For example, Haldane, who is one of the early contributors to population genetics, said the phrase survival of the fittest is something about tautology. So are most mathematical theorems. There is no harm in stating the truth in two different ways. But more elaborate was C.H. Washington, 1960. He said, natural selection turns out on closer inspection to be a tautology, a statement of an inevitable, although previously unrecognized relation. It states that the fittest individuals in a population, defined as those which leave the most offspring, will leave the most offspring. Once this statement is made, the truth is apparent. The fact in no way reduces the magnitude of Darwin's achievement. Only after it was clearly formulated could biologists realize the enormous power of the principle as a measure of explanation. More recently, this author, very famous, I'm sure many people here have read his books. He's a philosopher, and he's specialized on evolution and the debates surrounding evolution. He came up with another interesting way of looking at this tautology pseudo-problem. He says, well, natural selection is not quite a theory, it is more like an algorithm. It is an algorithm that allows things to happen the way they do. So once you understand the algorithm, you know what to expect given certain conditions. So this is what natural selection is. And that was quite satisfactory to me in terms of accepting it as let's say, to fit into a pigeonhole of scientific tools. And so natural selection is not quite a theory, it's slightly different. Of course, if anyone wants to read about natural selection in its quantifiable form, the papers by this guy are absolutely essential. George Williams, he basically refurbished natural selection for a good part of the middle 20th century. His books are still in print, and they're still textbooks, useful textbooks. Eventually, all these things came together in a lot of popular books, which are partly scientific, partly popular, like Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. What he did in this book is to focus on the level at which things are selected. And he went down to the extreme view that selection only acts on the gene. This is correct, selection acts on the gene, but many people objected to the fact that selection also acts on other levels of biological organization. So it's not the genes, but groups of genes. And it's not just groups of genes, but also whole genomes. And it's not whole genomes, but individuals and all the way to groups. But not groups in the sense of monophyletic group. No, there's nothing, nobody ever proposed selection for monophyletic groups. Just groups of individuals within the same species. Depending on the biology of the organisms you're dealing with, indeed you can have selection at several different levels. But Dawkins' flag of the gene as the unit of selection has been very, very important. It actually woke up a lot of people to the fact that you can explain a lot of biological phenomenon at several more complex levels by focusing on the gene. Many people, everybody knows The Origin of Species, but not that many people also know this other book by Darwin, 1871, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. I think I showed this slide at my first lecture. This book is extremely interesting in terms of revealing the depth of Darwin's mind. He obviously did a lot of work on natural selection. He explained a lot of the world, the living world, based on the principles of evolution that he himself discovered and natural selection. But he noticed there are a few things that could not be explained by selection, by straight theory of natural selection. There must have been another thing going on that was not quite exactly natural selection as he was seeing it. These things were, for example, ornaments that you see in one sex, or sometimes both sexes of many animals. How do you explain this thing? I mean, this obviously has no adaptive value to the animal that carries it. This is energy costly. This attracts attention of predators. It makes its evasion from predators more difficult. I mean, it's a pain in the neck to have this big tail. How do you explain natural selection to favor genes that code for this? Or to code whatever inherited particles you have that will result in this aberration. How do you explain this? He knew this was a problem. And there are many examples like this. So he started thinking about the problem, dedicated a lot of time to it, and came up with a theory of sexual selection, which is a very, very consistent theory that took a long time to receive its due attention, the attention it deserves. Actually, it was discredited for a lot of the early 20th century. Many people thought, Darwin was a great guy, but every once in a while he's lived a little bit like when he invented sexual selection. That was common to hear. You could hear that. So you can read that. Eventually, people discovered that this was actually a very brilliant idea. This was an extraordinary idea that explains a lot of things that you see in the real world. And which cannot be explained by any other method. It cannot be explained by regular natural selection. You need another kind of selection. Darwin realized that not only the environment can select, but also individuals within a species can select each other. Because in most species there is a competition for mates. So sex is a selective factor. So if you have factors, if you have conditions that affect your success in making sex, that equals affecting your success in reproduction. And eventually that boils down to selection in just the same way. But the agent is different. The agent is the species itself, or members of its species. And although this seems like a simple idea, it has interesting ramifications that are quite unexpected, but quite backed empirically. This is something that Alfred Russel Wallace never touched upon. This idea, we saw that natural selection came up was also thought about by many people. But sexual selection, there's not a single example. Sexual selection, Darwin was the only one to think about it. Some people read between the lines of some authors and say, oh yeah, he was talking about something similar here and there, but no, that's a stretch, that's, splitting hairs. Actually, sexual selection is a Darwinian idea. If he hadn't thought about it, it would have taken decades until someone else thought about it, really, because the idea is quite subtle. You need to know a lot about the natural world in order for the idea to begin to make sense. So how does it work? The funny thing about sexual selection is that it doesn't need an adaptive basis. That may sound strange because natural selection is so linked to adaptation. But in sexual selection, it doesn't. Why? Because immediately when you have a preference for a given trait in a specific individual of a population, you automatically increase the fitness of that individual and yours. That second part is not very evident. But why is that? Because if you successfully mate with the individual that carries the trait that you find attractive, doesn't matter what it is, doesn't need to be adaptive, doesn't need that, it can be completely random. The thing just happens. If it happens, it begins to make sense. What happens let's say females and males, because in vertebrates that's often the case. Males compete for the females. There are biological reasons for that we can elaborate later, but that everybody knows that this is what happens in most animals, most vertebrates. Anyway, they get together. The females like this male because this male has a trait, okay? They have offspring. The offspring will inherit two things. They will inherit the trait of the father, and they will inherit the preference for that trait by the female. So the two things are inherited together in the new generation. What happens then? Then the females will be attracted to the males that have those traits. So if you have a population of that, the males and the females begin to have higher fitness just because they prefer each other. They don't need to be faster, they don't need to be healthier, they don't need to be anything, they just need to prefer each other. And then they no longer are mating randomly in the population, which means that they're above the average in terms of reproductive success. Eventually, this becomes incredibly powerful because at each generation you get inheritance for the traits from the two parents, expressed in males, not expressed in females, and inheritance, let me just finish this, of the preference by the female, expressed in females but not expressed in males. So this has a multiplying effect that ends up in the most absurd conditions that we see sometimes, like the peacock tail.
It seems like the logical extension of this is that there would be a lot of mating among siblings, because they would have the traits.
Yeah,
and the preferences.
but of course there are other mechanisms.
Yeah.
This is not the only one.
Right.
Okay, this is just an explanation detached from other
Yeah.
considerations.
Yeah.
But there are also obvious costs for inbreeding,
Right.
because the
Right.
deleterious genes get homozygotic, and then
Yeah.
they're basically eliminated very quickly. No matter how much they like each other, they will not live healthy. Because of course there is a limit to that. And the limit is natural selection. Eventually the trait gets so absurdly developed that it becomes a cost, becomes a liability. And then you have, of course, we have other factors. The animal has to survive, the animal has to live, it has to escape predators, it has to get to adulthood. So eventually this reaches a balance. That's why you don't have peacocks with 10-yard tails. You know, at one point it stops. It needs to eat, it needs to walk, it needs to it needs to live like a normal bird despite that thing. So eventually all these traits reach an upper limit where they can't go any further. Of course they can't go any further under those circumstances. If they change, sometimes you have to. Like the tusks in elephants. In many populations in Africa today you have adult male elephants without tusks because the hunting has been so heavy that they eliminated the genes for the tusks from some populations. They only killed the ones that had tusks. So every population has a few that, as part of the polymorphism of the population, do not have tusks as adults. These had a higher fitness. They killed everybody except those. Because why kill an elephant that doesn't have tusks? So some natural populations of elephants in Africa today don't have tusks. So this is another. Of course, the final result of selection is a mix of all these factors. But sexual selection is so strong that it produces products that you cannot explain by regular natural selection. And that's why the theory came about. It is very well thought out. I mean, if natural selection is something, okay, the product of a very smart guy. Sexual selection was the product of a very subtle mind. I mean, the guy's really good. And of course, we all know examples that are really, really extreme. Usually associated with sexual dimorphism. When you see sexual dimorphism, that means when the male and female are very different, usually that's a good flag for sexual selection. Not always, but usually it is. So if you want to start somewhere looking for sexual selection, it is a good idea to start with things that have strong sexual dimorphism. But sexual dimorphism is not only morphological. Sexual dimorphism also applies to behavior. For example, this bird here, it builds a nest to attract the female, but it likes to ornament the nest with blue things. Bright color, usually, preferably blue, but there are other colors, it will go for other colors too. It attracts the females doing, picking little bright things. The females like this, they are attracted to this, and that increases the fitness of the male, and eventually the female too, along the generations, for the reasons we just discussed. So it doesn't apply only to morphology. It applies to everything, all the properties of an organism. Of course, there is some dimorphism here too. For example, the males are bright blue, the females are a different color. The extension of this idea led to this guy, Geoffrey Miller. He wrote this book, very nice book. I recommend it reading to anybody who has an interest in evolution, The Mating Mind. What was his idea? His idea is that the human brain is a product of sexual selection, of a very extreme form of sexual selection called runaway sexual selection, in which the things that the brain can do became apparent to the other sex and became a tool of attraction. And we are what we are in terms of intelligence because of sexual selection for intellectual traits. Expressed as language, expressed as music, expressed as theater or representation in front of your community, and things like that. And that would explain the explosive development of the brain at a certain stage in the development, the evolution of our species. It is a very good book. It is convincing, but of course he had to publish it as a book because the ideas are kind of good ideas, but you still need more work to actually prove that. But it's very appealing. It's very nice. And runaway sexual selection is just sexual selection to the nth degree, because you have no impediment, basically, for a long time to that process of positive feedback between attraction to a trait and the trait itself. Okay? In our case, of course, there is the size of the brain eventually became a limiting factor, because we couldn't be born anymore. The brain is too big. We did everything we could. I mean, women get big hips, big hip bones. What else? We are born very prematurely, but at a certain point, I mean, it becomes really difficult to carry on the trend. So sexual selection, I said, explains a lot of things in terms of sexual dimorphism, for example, but not always. There are other factors that result in sexual dimorphism. For example, this is an elephant seal. The male here, the poor female is here. So the male is like 10 times the size of the female. It's the only seal that actually copulates sideways. Because if it was on top, they wouldn't leave many descendants. The female would always die, crushed under the male. So they actually made sideways. They developed a way of doing it without one of them dying. So this is a form of male competition. I mean, the males fight physically for the females, for the harem that they have. So, of course, the bigger males always have an advantage, and that results in the next generation always being disproportionately represented by sons of very big males. So they get very big. So you ask, why don't they both get very big? Well, because being big has a cost. You have to eat a lot. Your physiology has to change because you're the one changing. So there is a lot of other factors that need to be adjusted. So there is negative pressure for the females to grow, but positive pressure for the males because of male competition. Yeah?
in these extreme color patterns and peacocks, it's males, but is it usually males, and is it usually males in species which are polygamous? Because if 90% of the males die, it doesn't hurt the species.
Yeah, it's because of that. Usually it's male competition for the females because the female investment is much larger. I mean the male gamete is very abundant. The female gamete, and not only the female gametes, but also what the female will invest later, on that is very large. So that's the reason why you have more of the new characteristics appearing in males rather than females. If you look at sexual-dimorphic species, you always notice that the females change less in several species of the same, let's say in a tree. The females all look more or less the same, and the males are very different from each other. So evolution is faster, not in the genes of males. The genes are the same, of course. They are all identical. The expression of the genes only.
So it's not the reason there's the bigger diversity in just, you look at human populations on various scores, there's much more diversity in males than females. That's not the Y chromosome, that's the expression of the genes throughout?
It depends on what you're talking about. What do you mean by more variation in males than females? What kind of variation you're talking about?
If you look at intelligence,
Uh-huh. It's
one
spread.
hundredth of 1% males, but the average male intelligence is lower.
Mhm.
Because there are more male idiots by a lot, large shot too.
And more geniuses too, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Females tend to be closer to average. Males tend to spread more. Yeah. Yeah.
And then in terms of height, in terms of all sorts of things. I mean, the average is higher for males, but
Oh yeah.
there's still, the giants are much more common than giantesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a fact. Yes.
But
But
it's not obvious whether that's Y chromosome or the expression.
oh, it's the expression, definitely,
Okay.
definitely. Because many of the characteristics that we see, they're not like one gene. They're a combination of genes. So yeah, that's an interesting question. It allows me to actually go into an interesting concept. Many people think trait, gene, trait, gene. It's not always like that. Sometimes, if you have, let's say, you have to grow big like this animal, you have other physiological things that have to go with getting big, right? You need a stronger heart, you need a different system of temperature control, otherwise you'll overheat. So a lot of things change, but the genetic composition of the two is the same. So what does it happen? What happens is that genes get linked. So you increase the probability that the gene for getting big always goes together with the gene for the physiology of temperature for a very big animal. Because if they get detached, they will not work. Or at least one of them will be lethal. So what happens is in crossover in the chromosomes, when cells are splitting by meiosis, they change genes. So the closer the genes are in the chromosome, the less likely it is that they will be split, right?
Yeah.
So as time goes by, you select for genes that are very, very close by, genes that only function, only have fitness value if they go together. So that's called linkage. So when two genes are adjacent to one another, they're linked. They very rarely get detached. And when they do, things do not turn out well because they're made to. They're evolved in dependency of one another. And you have a whole hierarchy of dependency on genes. So when they're very far away in the chromosome, usually they don't affect each other in terms of the fitness. But when they're very close, they do. So this has nothing to do with gene frequency, it has to do with gene position. Right? So often this is what happens. Like, why are males bigger than females? The genes are the same. Because the growth factors in humans are sensitive to testosterone. It makes the growth factor more effective. So they're the same. They function just the same way in men and women. But in men, there is another factor that makes their expression bigger. That's it. That's why there is difference in size. And that's most of the case. Very rarely they are associated with the sex chromosomes themselves. Some animals don't even have sex chromosomes. The difference between sexes is only epigenetic, like crocodiles and alligators. Males and females are genetically identical. The eggs, which are higher temperature, become males, at a lower temperature in the nest become females. So you maintain a decent ratio male-female without having any genetic difference. And they have different behavior, different morphology, everything.
And that's
Yeah.
one of the models of the sensitivity of dinosaurs to extinction was that if there were, it got to the extreme such that you only had one sex for a while, even if they made it through.
Speculation.
Speculation,
Yeah,
yes.
speculation.
I've heard about that. As
Yeah.
speculation.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting speculation, and I'm all in favor of speculation, but this is still speculation today. Anyway, we have very extreme cases of sexual dimorphism. Since I'm an ichthyologist, of course, I like examples from fish. So this is a deep sea fish. I'm sure everybody here has seen creatures like this in documentaries and encyclopedias and things like that. These things actually exist. I mean, some of the ugliest creatures on this planet. They are bathypelagic fish. They live very deep in the water, but still far from the bottom. So they're like a few miles away from the surface and a few miles away from the bottom. They just they don't see any surface their whole lives except their own bodies. And in some of them, the males became very, very reduced. For example, this fish here is a female. This is the male. The male became parasitic on the female. It attaches to the female the first time it sees one and never lets it go. Well, some species they do. There is variation there. But in the most extreme cases, the male becomes parasitic on the female. This is just a photograph of freshly caught fish. They look very different, fresh. So these are two males. Not always it's only one. Sometimes 2, 3, 4. And they find a female and they attach. Why? Because the concentration of these things down there is so low that you may spend your whole life without seeing another fish. So when you find one, you better bite it and never let go. So that's what the males do. They have these big noses that detect pheromones in the water, and basically they spend their young ears just through the water, and they find a female, and never. Okay, they become an organ, a reproductive organ of the female. They even fuse with the female. They don't eat anymore. They just suck blood from the female. The eyes disappear, the mouth disappears, everything disappears. They become basically a testicle, and the females become a bisexual organism. It's one of the most extreme cases. And it's not exactly sexual selection. It's something different. They're selected because of their environment. It's so terribly devoid of life that you have to do, if anything survived there and prospered there, it has to be something that has a special means of getting a mate. This is their cladogram, their evolutionary tree. Even that to know. See the diversity? It's a lot of fish actually. And here have males never attached to females, which are the primitive ones, close to primitive, of course, not in a pejorative sense, close to the base of the tree. And then eventually you have some that are facultative parasites. The males sometimes grab the females, sometimes they don't. Then you have obligate parasites, which are the blue ones. And in many, you have males attaching temporarily. So you see that this is something that began to evolve here and then got more extreme in certain cases, okay? Which is what we expect. This is actually a very well-known group nowadays. Most of the species are known from a few specimens only. But there are many other cases in not only vertebrates, which should not be vertebrate oriented only. This is schistosoma, the agent for schistosomiasis. What you see here is basically a bisexual animal too. The fat one with a groove in the middle is the male, and the thin one is the female. So when the two meet inside of us, the male basically embraces the female with these two folds and never let her go. So they stay bisexual, basically. She releases the egg, he releases the sperm, and they have nothing else to do because they are really obligate parasites. They live in our blood, so they just swim in the blood and everything gets inside of them easily. They don't need to eat, they don't need to do anything. Only reproduce. So if you got schistosomiasis, as I did once in West Africa, you had things like this swimming inside of you, inside of your blood. Of course, everybody knows these cases. This is the opposite. The female is very big. In many invertebrates, you get the opposite. You get the females being very big, and the males are small. There are factors, of course, that lead to this situation as well. these animals, or many of them, of course in many spiders it's not like that. There are thousands and thousands of species. Some are like this. Most males and females are approximately the same size, or even the male a little bigger. But in some, the size difference is extreme in favor of the females being bigger. There's only one which is the opposite. Among all species of spiders, there's one where the male is a lot bigger than the female, like this in the opposite. Why? Because in many spiders, what you need for the male is to find a female and reproduce as soon as possible. So there's pressure for them to become mature at smaller and smaller sizes, because it's faster. Growing to this size takes a long time. Growing to this size takes less time. So that depends on the circumstances in which lineages are operating. Just for you to see how selective pressures can be unpredictable, this is one of the largest differences in size among fish. This is a cichlid from one of the West African lakes. This is the male, and this thing here is the female. These are the true adults. They're actually husband and wife. So what happens there? I mean, why the female has to be so small? Obviously, it has to be cryptic too, because many things are bigger than this female and can eat her. So she kind of has this cryptic color against the background. The male doesn't need that because it's big. It's not many people who eat it. Because this thing, not only this one, but other species around it in the phylogeny, they always lay their eggs inside these shells. And that's the only way that eggs will survive. It's a lake full of fish. They like to eat eggs, other fish. So the female has to fit inside this to lay her eggs. So while there was perhaps sexual selection, perhaps male competition, perhaps a combination of the two for males to get bigger, there was strong selection for females to stay small because they always had to fit these small snails at the bottom of the lake. These snails cover the bottom of the lake. They're an excellent spot to put eggs in safety. So you see that these two forces, they act against each other to result in the final phenomenon that we see. Sometimes it looks very incongruent, like why we have such a thing. Usually when you have sexual dimorphism, the two go more or less the same direction, although one of them can go a little more extreme. But in some cases, it's much more extreme and restricted to one sex. The female is exactly the same size as the female of the closer species around this one, phylogenetically. But the male has gotten very, very big. And that's the reason. If the females got big, they would go extinct. The ones that had big females did not survive because they didn't fit in the snail, the eggs were eaten, and they were eventually extinct. And there are many cases that could go on forever. This is one of those crustaceans. How do they call this in English? I forgot. You see them in beaches everywhere, right? But this is a particular species. You see, well, if you turn one of them upside down, you see that there is another little one here in the belly, often held by one of the legs. You see that one of the legs is actually holding this one. You see leg, no leg. The leg is inside here holding this smaller one. This smaller one is the female. And it lives in the belly of the male, sorry about that, in the belly of the male its whole adult life. And people recently discovered, I mean, why? They're abundant. I mean, the male doesn't need to grab the female for the rest of his life. There are females everywhere. It's the sex ratio. They're abundant. It's just because there is so much male competition for the females that if the females are unprotected, the males will start fighting for her, pulling her legs, and she ends up without any legs and dies. So she has to be under a male her whole life. So as soon as a male finds a female, it goes there. And then she's protected, no other male can grab a piece of her. Yes, nature can be tragic. Huh?
You said you don't know the name in English. What is the name in Portuguese?
Baratinho de praia. Yeah, it's an isopod, but this doesn't mean much more about it. I knew it, I just forgot temporarily. But anyway, everybody knows this, right? It's not the same species that we see here, okay? It's another species, there are many species. Almost all groups that we show, we have thousands of species, okay? So generalizations such as the beetle don't exist. Very difficult. Just for you to have an idea, there are approximately 40,000 species of vertebrates. Us, fish, birds, mammals, reptiles, everything, amphibians, you know. One family of beetle, for example, the weevils, family Curculionidae, has 65,000 species. That's 50% more than all vertebrates, and that's one family of beetles. There are many families of beetles. This is just one. So diversity is big on this planet. Okay, but one interesting thing that when we think about sex is why sex? It's a basic question that many people have honestly asked. Why do you say? Why don't things just split? I mean, I'm one, I split, I'm two. Why this sex is costly? It's not always successful. Only one sex actually carries the eggs usually. So it obviously is something that costs a lot in terms of efficiency. Why we make sex? Well, as a matter of fact, many animals don't do sex, and many plants don't do sex. Asexual reproduction is quite common, is a common phenomenon in life. Even invertebrates, for example, this is a parthenogenetic lizard, for example. There are no males, the females just develop their eggs directly. This is called parthenogenesis, and it's not very rare. It's common in many organisms. This is also an interesting fish in terms of its sexual system. It could not quite get to parthenogenesis completely, but it got as close as you can get. It needs a male, but the genetic material of the male does not get in the egg. It just triggers development of the egg, but then is expelled, and the new offspring is a clone of the female. So it needs males, but the males do not actually contribute genetically to the next generation. Your question? I think I know what you're going to ask.
You have the negatives of sex, but without the positives, from an evolutionary standpoint.
You have the negatives, but not the positives.
Yeah, you still need to have the two sexes.
Oh, okay, I understand what you mean. No, yeah, you need, because the evolution of these things are not planned on paper.
Right.
So it is getting rid of males, but it cannot just do like this with males anymore. Because there is all the mechanisms of development depends on something that gets in there. The sperm has to touch the egg. So it's gradually getting rid of it, but the mechanism has to be fixed or changed while it's still functional. So many things in evolution are like that. You see the remains of things that are there. Right? So you ask, why didn't they go all the way? Right? Because there has not been enough time. They are going. And we know that because we have phylogenies that show that other things are getting there. So it's a gradual process. It's not.
Sorry, the opossum is the gamba.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I had gamba or the opossum is it's a very old animal. 130 million years ago.
Oh yeah, the opossums are the heroes of
especially the
of
Brazilian
South
one.
America.
Then I had one in my house for 1 year, and it's funny. Old men have the penis here and the how do you say the bolus?
The testes.
The testicles down. This animal it's on the other side.
Yeah.
It's funny. You know?
It is funny, yeah.
It's on the other side, and there's no reproduction.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to ask a mammalogist exactly the reasons for that, what they are. But yeah, this is true. I've noticed that too.
Yeah.
I've also had the doubtful pleasure of seeing the genitals of opossums, and it's caught my attention as well. Well, I think these are all marsupials actually.
Yeah.
They're all like this. Yeah. Yeah, but they're quite normal, except for that. They're quite normal in terms of sexual system.
I know there are a lot of trees which typically reproduce asexually, but also occasionally produce sexually. Are there a significant number of animals which do that, or is it one way or the other?
Oh yeah, many. I'm going to show one example, at least. One example in relation to another subject, but it will come. Yeah, there are animals that are facultative as well. There are animals that change sex easily. Males become females. Sometimes vice versa as well. This one is interesting because, as I was saying, it depends on the male for triggering the development of the egg, but it doesn't have males. There are no males, no females. So how did it happen? It parasitizes another species that has males. So the males of this other species copulate to them, and they go away. So they depend on some males, but they don't have the males around, so they borrow from another. So they're called sexual parasites. It's like the name of a porn movie or something with the sexual parasites. For many years, people thought that these uniparental reproduction was restricted to females, that there are no cases of males without females reproducing. It makes sense, right, because males do not produce eggs. But now, with genetic techniques, people are beginning to discover that there are many cases of uniparental species composed of males only, which is highly, highly counterintuitive. One of the first cases discovered was this African, the Sahara cypress, which is a very rare tree. People, now we understand its history. It occurs in the middle of the Sahara Desert, which is strange because it's a big tree. Usually big trees don't grow in places like that. In some special places, and there are only a few specimens, like a few hundred specimens. They're all cataloged individually. People are paying a lot of attention to them, and they're composed exclusively of males.
So hang on,
They're dioecious. Yeah, they're males and females in this tree.
so you haven't defined males and females, but my understanding is the males have the small
Yes,
gametes,
yes,
females big. And
yes.
so this one is defined as a male because it just has pollen? or-
It just has pollen. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
and somehow that develops into a tree?
That was a mystery for a while, yes. Especially because all these trees are like 300 years old or older. So something was not going well, huh? And they're all males. So people speculated, well, maybe the females died differentially, something, an epidemic that only caught on females or something. But no, it's actually a viable tree. Now we understand exactly what happens. It also parasitizes other trees, other tree species of the same genus. Its pollen gets to the other trees, and then it hijacks the genetic system of that, basically takes hold of the control of the cell, expels the female genes of the other species, and develops its own seed. So it's a seed parasite. Why doesn't it happen now? Because obviously the reason it evolved is because it's very tough to desiccation. It can live in places that no other cypress can live in terms of how dry it is. It can survive dry conditions, very dry. And the Sahara has been getting drier and drier. So now there are no other trees that survive in the area where it occurs. So it became alone. So it can't parasitize anybody. All the other cypresses disappeared from the area. I mean, for hundreds of years already.
But they've done this in the lab? and-
Yeah, now it's all over the place, yeah. They took it to many botanical gardens and people, now it's a common tree, yeah. They're even beginning to suspect it may become a pest because it hijacks the other cypresses, basically.
Oh.
And that turns them into factories of its own seed. And they're all males. There are things, in animals too, this is just being discovered now. Some of the stick insects also have some funny sexual system. It's not yet completely untangled. And you sometimes have only males. That somehow they manage to reproduce. People don't know exactly why. You need to know some of the biology of the animals to actually tell the whole story, to solve the puzzle. Another thing, I put this in honor of Renato, actually, this example, because there are so many wonderful examples. We have to pick them on the basis of something. Okay, Renato
You better
asked me.
explain why you put it in my
Oh, okay. No, it's actually, there is a biological reason. Because another thing, in addition to sex, we ask why we make sex and not why don't all the animals have the two sexes, right? It would be a lot more efficient because it could just cross-copulate and both of them will lay eggs. In fact, many of them do that. And this is one of them. Many of the land snails are bisexual. But they're not bisexual simultaneously. They're bisexual in sequence. So for example, these
Just a pause here, I think is necessary.
Huh?
This is in my honor because I found this too in my house.
Yeah, he sent me photographs of these things copulating in his garden. And he asked, what is this? It's so immoral. And then I told him the story, it became even more immoral. Because what you see here is gay sex. Because they're first males. They're both bisexual, but sequentially. But first they mature as males. So what they do, the two males mature, they cross-copulate, and each one gets the sperm of the other. After that, they separate and they become females. But they already have their stock of sperm, so they don't need another male. So they do sex when they're males, and then they become females, and the eggs develop, and they lay the eggs. So that's how it happens. So both lay eggs. It's very efficient. Hey, no wonder these things become a pest sometimes. So because we have two egg-laying creatures there as a result of sex. But if you want to get really, really weird, we can ask also, well, why do we have two sexes? Why two? Right? Couldn't we have more? This is a known question because if you look into the natural world, there are many things that have more than two sexes. You can have 3, 4, 5. Protozoans have many sexes. Some ciliates are the record holders. They can have up to 100 different sexes. does this make sense?
What does that mean, 100 sexes?
It means the following thing. Well, let's say you are in a population, you. Okay, you want to copulate with someone. You cannot copulate with everybody. No, you can. But I mean, in order to leave offspring, you need to copulate with a certain kind of people. Otherwise, there won't be the next generation. But it doesn't say. So that reduces the possibilities, right? You need someone who has the opposite sexual system as you, if you want to leave offspring. But because you have only two. So on average, if the sex ratio is 50-50, you lose half of the population as potential partners. If you have 3 sexes, you only lose 1/3, because you have 2 possibilities that are different from you. You have 4 sexes, you only need 20%. If you have 100 different sexes, you can pretty much have sex with anyone you want, right? It will be 1 in 100 that will be like you and will not leave a valid offspring, viable offspring. Right? So that's probably the reason. Has not been tested experimentally, but that's the reason. So you can have up to 100 different sexes.
But you only need 2 to copulate.
Right, right. Oh yeah, that's a general rule. Never it's more than 2. I don't know any example. I'm waiting for it to appear, you know. Life is old. There can be something somewhere in some crevice that actually needs 3 sexes. I mean, how many protozoa? We know a lot of protozoans, but there's certainly more to be discovered. Who knows? They may be there. But the real evolutionary puzzle that has recently been almost solved is this creature here. These are rotifers. They're kind of a little worm that has 2 fins on the head. You know, biologists know this very well, but not everybody else. And they exist everywhere. And there is one large subgroup of rotifers, which are called the Deloid rotifers. You pronounce, I think, Deloid rotifers, which are completely asexual. They are composed of females only. Okay, that's okay. We have seen many species of that. But all the species we know, all the cases we know, are species that have very small ranges. They're not very diverse. All the groups that are parthenogenetic, that are uniparental. And they don't last too long. There are reasons for that we're going to see soon, but usually asexual lineages accept things like really primitive living beings that can be asexual for a long time, but they have other mechanisms. But if you see big animals, asexual, they usually occur in a small range, they're not very diverse, and they don't last too long, okay? But this is an exception. This is a very large group, has existed for tens of millions of years, and very diverse, 350 species. And worst of all, they have a very well-resolved phylogeny, which should be impossible for things with such method of reproduction. They're all clones, so you shouldn't be able to even make a good classification of them in this case. So that was a mystery for a long time. Even Maynard Smith, who was one of the great evolutionary biologists of this century, referred to them as an asexual scandal. Because they can't be asexual. They have to have sex, but many people study these things. Many generations, never a single case of sex was observed. The mystery was only solved, but this is just one of the papers on that. But the mystery was only solved more recently when molecular techniques began to get really common and people discovered that these things basically make sex with everything around them. They make sex with their environment. They're always changing genes with whatever is around them. Nobody knows exactly the mechanism. There is massive horizontal gene transfer in delicate rotifers. Perhaps the only such case in metazoans. They're not protozoans, they're metazoans. Okay, these are real animals, like a little worm. And this became like a big science now. Many people are working on this to try to disentangle everything. Rotifers are really weird. They can withstand radiation, desiccation, blah, blah, blah. They're toughies. Apparently their DNA has evolved a shape or something that allows it to reassemble functionally after severe damage, just by chemical loss among the molecules. We don't know exactly what happens. But the thing is, they're not really asexual. That's what matters in terms of the evolution of sex. They are not asexual. That's why they look like a sexual image. They are a sexual image. Maynard Smith died before he could see this, but he would be very happy because he was the one who forbade them to be asexual. He said, no, they cannot be asexual. Something is wrong. or rotiferologists are not doing a good job in discovering sex in these animals. Okay, now let's go to why sex. I entered this question, but I didn't answer it. Why we have sex in life? Why we make sex? Why is it necessary to shuffle genes with another specimen? The best answer to this question came from this guy. This is Envolving. He's a completely out of the mainstream guy, but very, very famous. He was at the University of Chicago most of his career. He's dead now. And he published his own journal because he couldn't get his papers to get accepted in regular journals. So this is actually a paper he published at home. He just printed it. And it's incredibly cited. I mean, any journal would pay a lot of money to have this paper because it's being cited thousands of times every year. It's very important. It's in this paper that, well, he was not unaware of the importance of his ideas. You see the title, A New Evolutionary Law. Okay, you have to be pretty certain of yourself to publish a paper with this title. Anyway, he came up with the idea after doing some surveys of fossils in the fossil record and making lots of graphs and things like that. He discovered one interesting thing that to a less observant person might seem like trivial, but it wasn't for him. He discovered that the rate of extinction is constant and linear across time for many different lineages. Fishes, reptiles, mammals, trilobites. He made many. There are pages and pages of just these graphs. He discovered the rate of extinction of lineages is always linear. It's constant. Why is that? We should see different curves there, but they are constant. And he elaborates on the idea, rather quantitative actually, and he concluded the following. The reason why the rate is constant is because things do not evolve in isolation. They don't get better and better adapted to their surroundings. They're always at the same spot. Because in any evolving system, you co-evolve with everything which is around you, competing for the same resources. So you evolve, but you stay in the same place because other things that hunt you, that parasitize you, that compete with you in any form, they are also evolving systems. So you stay at the same place. So extinction is simply stochastic. Pretty interesting, huh? And he did that without leaving his lab, just reading and getting data. And if he had found this only for one group, okay, but he found for tens of groups. It's always like that. The rate of extinction is always the same. Then he came up with what is today called the Red Queen hypothesis. Well, the American answer was actually here. For an evolutionary system, continued development is needed just in order to maintain its fitness relative to the systems it is co-evolving with. Where did the name come from? From Lewis Carroll, Alice Through the Looking Glass, because there is it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you stop, you die, basically in biology. It's not Alice in Wonderland, it's actually Alice Through the Looking Glass. Alice in Wonderland also has a queen. It's the dictatorial queen that kills everybody by decapitation. No, this one is different. It's a better queen. So that's where the name comes from. Many people don't know where the name came from. It's from there. So why is it important? Because eventually, he actually did that in his paper, but people developed that later. Sex came as a result of the Red Queen hypothesis. The idea of the adaptive significance of sex came as a result of the Red Queen hypothesis. Because we are always competing with things that want to kill us and eat us. Bacteria, parasites, things that we don't see, but they are always in action. They're always trying to kill us. And you have to find a way of evolving your immune system as fast as they do. Because they evolve very fast. Bacteria evolve very fast. Our generations can take 20 years, but 20 years we could have billions of generations of bacteria. So they evolve very fast. You need a very sophisticated immune system to deal with them. Not only that, but we also need this immune system to be variable enough to follow the rate of mutation that they have. So we need sex in order to have this necessary variation to withstand infections, basically to survive a world populated with bacteria that want to use us as resources. When I say us, I'm talking about eukaryotes, okay? Not just us as species. We're talking about the life on Earth. Everybody that has sex. has this been tested? Yes, very nicely so, many times. So the Red Queen is probably the right explanation for the existence of sex on this planet. For example, there are many papers. This is just one of them. In this paper, they took you had asked me about, are there organisms that are sometimes sexual, sometimes asexual? I said there are several. One of them is Caenorhabditis, very well-known thing. We know everything about Caenorhabditis. Basically, you can trace the lineage of every cell in the animal today, according to this genome. Anyway, this thing can be sexual or asexual, depending on conditions. This is not unusual at all. What they did in this paper was to separate populations so that some of them underwent infection pressure, and some of them lived in sterilized conditions without any danger from parasites, from bacteria. And what happens? In the populations that were exposed to pathogens, they only reproduce sexually. And if you had a lineage that was incapable to do sex and subjected them to the bacteria, they went extinct. So obviously they cannot evolve as fast as bacteria. They need sex to compensate for this. So most likely, sex originated as a response, Red Queen-like response, to our coevolution with bacteria and other things that we need our immune system to fight. So,
But at the evolutionary line, the immune system is earlier than the sex in the animal. So how do you explain it?
sorry?
The sex is older than the human immune system in the evolutionary line, isn't it? So how do you explain this?
Sex is older.
It's older than the system immune system in the line of evolution. So, for example, sponge, they have sex and they don't have immune system.
Well, but they have resistance, right?
Oh, hey, right. About
Yeah,
resistance.
doesn't need to be necessarily the immune system.
Oh, okay, okay.
But they're resistant. I mean, plants don't have immune systems, but they certainly have lots of viruses and bacteria that eat them.
Okay.
They just develop like a hard cell wall that protects them from that.
Resistance at
So
all.
yes, resistance in general. Just need more variations so you can follow the evolution of bacteria. But the solutions are many, many different solutions. One of them is the immune system. Rather efficient one, but there are other ones which are very efficient too. So you always have to fight bacteria, no matter where you are. Protozoans have to fight bacteria, and they have their means, and they evolve with that too. So the Red Queen came as a result of that, as an explanation for that. They need to be evolving these things to follow the evolution of bacteria. And other things, right? It's not just bacteria, it's all evolving systems around you. It's just as probably sex as a response to infection in general. Okay, what else do we have here? Okay, but there are still things that regular natural selection cannot explain, could not explain for a while, even after sexual selection, even after all these things. For example, how do you explain that very often you have behaviors that are apparently self-destructive for the benefit of your community? Altruistic behavior, this is called. Or why you have species where you have most of the individuals of a colony not reproducing and just taking care of one which reproduces, like many ants and bees, things like that. Or else, why do you have things that have such bright colors indicating that they are poisonous? If this very color and the teaching that they are poisonous is going to cost their lives, because they're very visible. The first bird that eats this is going to spit it out, but it's going to kill it in the process, right? It's never going to eat another one, but it needs to learn. It is not born knowing that this thing is not good to eat. So how do you have evolution of these things that so obviously are detrimental to the genes that carry forward these very behaviors and these very processes? What's the explanation for that? That was difficult for Darwin. He did not quite come with a good explanation. He almost got there, but not quite. This took a long time to happen. Oops, sorry. And the person responsible for it was William Hamilton. Some people, you ask some people who work on evolutionary biology, they say William Hamilton is the most important evolutionary biologist since Darwin. Because William Hamilton came with the idea of kin selection. He realized that selection did not apply only to the physical bearer of that gene, one moment. It applied also to the other bearers of the gene that surround that one. So you have something called inclusive fitness, which is the fitness not only of you, but your close relatives that also carry the same genes. But he did a good job. He actually went all the way. He actually developed a whole mathematical theory to explain for the evolution of altruistic behaviors and other behaviors that are not well explained by traditional classical natural selection, with very good results, like everybody accepts these things. Of course, everybody knows Hamilton's rule. It's very simple. Of course, it gets very complicated when we begin to dissect these variables here. But basically, the coefficient of relatedness, which is R, has to be bigger than the cost of cooperation divided by the benefits of cooperation. If you have this inequality, you have potential evolution of altruism, sacrificing your own genes for the benefits of your relatives. So that's how these behaviors evolve. They can be positively selected. Just in case you're curious about more details about these variables, the coefficient of relationships is basically relatedness. The probability of two alleles in a single random locus being identical by descendants. Okay, that's the correct way of putting it. And then the rest is more or less the same. So an altruistic behavior, we would positively select it if the inequality above is valid. Of course, the level of relatedness depends on what relative you're talking about. So you're related 100% to yourself. Well, we are the most important person to ourselves anyway, or to a twin. A parent, a full sibling, or a child is 50% on average, has 50% on average the same genes. And then you go, great-grandparent, full cousin, blah, 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 with different values, getting further and further from one, smaller and smaller as you get further away. Which means that you can sacrifice yourself for 2 children or 2 full siblings. Okay, but you need like 4 or 8 cousins if you want to have the same result in the genetic lottery. In terms of, am I going to do that or not? Of course, this is not conscious. This works on average in populations. But it explains, because many, if not all, cases of altruistic behavior involve species that form groups, they're social. So they're always together with close relatives, separated from other such groups. So if you sacrifice yourself for your group, you're actually doing good to your genes. Because you die, but they carry your genes anyway. So it is possible to show that under such conditions, the frequency of this gene is going to improve. It has an elevated fitness, although it is self-destructive. So that was very good. It explained a lot that was not explainable before. Of course, Hamilton did not publish only that. He has many interesting papers. Just one other here is the molding of senescence by natural selection, which is something that we always think about. Why do we get old? I mean, why don't you just stay young forever? reproduce until you're killed by lightning or something. And he demonstrates that senescence is actually a consequence of selection in evolving systems. It's a necessary consequence. It's not adaptive, it's just a consequence. Why? Because as you go along in the life cycle, you get higher and higher rates of death. You simply die. Even if you don't have decay due to age, you will die, right? And as time goes by, your probability of being alive is smaller and smaller. So the population of animals or individuals in a population at the higher ages is always smaller than at the base, simply because death occurs. Therefore, all the selective mechanisms which are relevant for the change in genetic frequencies, they are much more efficient in the beginning when everybody is breeding. Later, it's not that important because most people will be dead anyway. Most individuals in the population will be dead after a certain amount of time. So, for example, if you have something, or a genetic variant, or a combination, that makes you particularly fit for reproduction when you're 20, and because of that you leave lots of offspring, you have a higher fitness, these same genes, when you're 50, can give you a brain cancer. The same genes over a long period of time can be the same ones that will kill you, and they will be positively selected nevertheless. Because it doesn't matter that they kill you later. What matters for selection is that you are beneficial to your fitness when you're young. And that's simply a mathematical result of how populations are structured. As time goes by, you have fewer and fewer individuals in a population at that age group. So selection will naturally favor the ones that have more abundant individuals. That idea actually was, it's an earlier idea by Peter Medawar, but he exposed it just in qualitative terms. He had this idea, he said, oh, probably that's what it is. It took a lot of work for him to prove that, theoretically, but he did. Hamilton did that. Medawar was dead already by the time. And by the way, this is the only Nobel Prize ever being from Brazil. Did you know that? Yeah, Peter Medawar, he was born in Petropolis.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. He was British, I mean, his parents were Lebanese, but he was born in Petropolis and he left to England when he was 7 or something like that. He never came back. He didn't even know where Brazil was. But he was born in Brazil. There is a Nobel Prize born in Brazil.
At least one.
Not really Brazilian to the full extent of the word, but he was born around here. Okay, I know I'm repeating this. This is a mistake. Eventually, the theory of kin selection was developed into the theory of sociobiology by a famous E.O. Wilson. I mean, this guy is actually really famous in biology. He not only invented sociobiology, he also invented the theory of island biogeography. He discovered pheromones, and he is a very world-renowned ant taxonomist on top of it all. He's still alive, he works at Harvard, he's retired now. Very important individual in general, with many popular books as well. I'm sure some of you have seen them, Human Nature and things like that. At the time, sociobiology became very, very famous. And it was the cover of Time magazine many times. Immediately, there was this wall of resistance to the ideas of social biology, because there is always some resistance to biology getting into sociology or human sciences in general. So there was enormous violent reaction to social biology. They tried to align him with Nazis, with eugenics, with all kinds of bad words, unsuccessfully, in my view. And the years following the publication have shown that social biology explains a lot of human nature, explains how we behave, explains why we make wars, explains why we take care of our children when they are our actual children, but not as well as when they are not our biological children. This is the statistics that only became available more recently. So social biology explains a lot of what we are. Not only what animals are, but we, as one more animal, what we are specifically. So it's a very, very powerful tool. He got inspired by Hamilton's work on kin selection. Kin selection is a big part of social biology because it explains social behavior, how social behavior could have evolved. How is it that you can actually quit reproducing to have others reproduce? Sometimes to the extreme of killing yourself. Of course, eugenics is a bad word, has not always been so. In the early 20th century, most of the world was eugenist. There are many people don't know that, but eugenics is not just something of the Nazis. Eugenics is something that actually guided the ideas on population for a long time. It was only a tad after Second World War, because it was associated with Nazis. This was so ugly that eugenics basically was a no-known word as well. What is eugenics? Study of the agencies under social control that improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. This is Francis Galton. This guy here was a cousin of Darwin, actually. He was a follower of evolution in general, and he was one of the champions of eugenics in the beginning. Of course, eugenics has a lot of problems too. I'm just giving this as a defense of social biology. I'll let you enjoy for a few seconds these old things for you to see just how popular eugenics ideas were and how some of them look outrageous today to us. Just take a look. These are all real ads. This one is particularly the most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. This is one of the champions of eugenics in the 1930s. Quite impressive, isn't it? How things change. So for a while, the eugenics movement was very, very much in favor throughout governments everywhere. You know, people just thought that human species was degenerating because of relaxed selection. So we needed to select a little more. And this went on until the 80s in some countries, like Canada was doing eugenics until the 80s in one form or another. We still do eugenics today. Parental counseling is a form of eugenics. You see that if the two members of a couple have the same recessive genes, they are advised not to have children because they will certainly have very serious conditions. So it's still today we do some eugenics, but of course it's in a very different form. It's voluntary. It was not voluntary in many places, including some of the civilized countries. But I won't go further into that. What I find is interesting for you to see is this paper that was recently published by two very famous evolutionary biologists, Martin Nowak and E. Wilson, and also a new rising star, Tarnita, they're all very bright. And they published this thing, The Evolution of Eusociality, they're basically saying that kin selection was not necessary to explain the phenomenon it was supposed to explain. The reaction to this paper, this is very recent, the reaction to this paper was violent. It's just very impressive. Saying things that sound really strange. For example, this is a response, one of the million responses that they got. We believe that their arguments are based on a misunderstanding of evolutionary theory. You, Wilson. Okay. Look at the number of people saying it. It's like, it's like almost a legal document. It's really weird. They reply to the reply, blah, blah. I agree with the critics, actually. After reading the things, yeah, I don't think they're right. No, kin selection is very useful. It actually explains much more simply a lot of things. What they say is that classical natural selection explains everything. You don't need kin selection. Okay, this gets very technical, and I want to get into it. How long have I talked?
You're already past 5 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I think this will be actually my last thing. This is, you guys seen this object and these people? There may be mathematicians here, no? These are two Hungarian mathematicians who discovered something very interesting, this object, which they called a gombok. And this was a mathematical problem that was considered very hot. Like, can you make a three-dimensional convex object homogeneous, that no matter how you let it on a flat surface, it will always straighten itself to the same position? Apparently these guys worked for a long time on that, and they finally discovered that this is the shape, after years of work. They first predicted it theoretically. Later, they built the object. After you can buy one of these, like $500, an official copy of your gombok. What does the gombok, they got prizes and things, and mathematicians things. Now, how do I do this to work? I'm gonna show you the gombok working. It's a film. Oh, okay, there you go. There we go. Let it go. It moves almost by its own force. There we got there. There's a second one. And then it eventually stabilizes like that. This is another one. There it goes. Apparently this was a great discovery in mathematics. All right. Stabilize it there. This is the gombok, and they worked for a long time to discover it. Eventually, let me see if I can change this slide. Yes. Eventually, they discovered that the gombok, or gombok-like shapes, are everywhere. Like some turtles have it, many beetles have it, things that basically can fall upside down and then need to straighten themselves back to the right, to their feet. And they tend to have gombok shapes. That's in an interview they said, well, we discovered it with mathematics, but evolution got there first. So, so you see that evolution in general is very well accepted by everywhere, even people who don't work on evolution. I mean, the evidence for it is just incredible. I'm not going to go into that because I'm too late. So if depends on the questions, I'll have some more slides to show about what happens to evolution in society. But right now I'm going to end here. Thank you.